Statement of Intent. This work is not written as a commentary upon a wound. It is written from within the wound's architecture, from within the labyrinth that both conceals and reveals the principles by which human beings become divided against themselves, estranged from one another, and disoriented before reality itself. What is here undertaken is not merely the description of moral injury, nor merely the poetic adornment of trauma, nor merely the philosophical arrangement of personal suffering into a system attractive enough to be tolerated by the intellectual conscience. This book is written under the conviction that moral injury names not simply an event, nor even a category of events, but an entire order of rupture, a destabilization of meaning so profound that what breaks is not only trust, not only innocence, not only coherence, but the very relation between perception, language, conscience, memory, and being. In such a rupture, the soul does not merely hurt. It becomes divided against the forms by which it once knew how to recognize the true, the good, the livable, and the real. For that reason, this work refuses every form too small to bear what it seeks to examine. It refuses the ordinary reduction of moral injury to a clinical subtype, a battlefield residue, an ethical complaint, a private crisis, or a decorative psychological theme. It refuses also the opposite reduction, by which suffering is romanticized, mystified, or made into an aesthetic atmosphere without responsibility to structure. This book proceeds from the belief that certain realities can only be approached truthfully when the form of inquiry is made answerable to the form of the rupture itself. Moral injury is not linear. Fear is not linear. Contradiction is not linear. Conscience under duress is not linear. Memory under violation is not linear. Therefore, any language claiming fidelity to such realities must itself be capable of layered return, recursive pressure, asymmetrical orientation, and structurally meaningful repetition. This is why the present work takes the form it does. It is not merely a book. It is a libretto, a thesis, an invocation, a map, a staged interiority, and a participatory architecture of traversal. What is attempted here is therefore larger than diagnosis, larger than argument, larger than private testimony, and larger even than interdisciplinary synthesis in the usual sense. This manuscript is written in service of what may have to be called a proto-philosophy, a proto-science, or more properly still, a rediscovered order of understanding whose fragments have always existed among us, but whose coherence has not been sufficiently named in the modern world. I am officially calling this emerging order Boanergics. By this, I do not mean a mere term, a style, an eccentric personal lexicon, or an ornamental school of thought invented for novelty. I mean an attempt to recover and generate a way of understanding that can move inward, outward, and all around at once. A way of seeing not constrained to one axis at a time. A way of reasoning that does not flatten complexity into sequence merely because sequence is easier to manage. A way of approaching reality that recognizes that the human being is not injured in one direction, healed in one direction, deceived in one direction, or awakened in one direction. We are traversed from within and without simultaneously. We are interpreted by what surrounds us even as we interpret it. We are shaped by forces seen and unseen, by absences as much as presences, by contradiction no less than by coherence, and by relations no less than by substances. If this sounds ambitious, it is because the task requires ambition commensurate with the scale of what has been neglected. The ancient world once produced philosophies adequate to cosmos, polis, soul, virtue, tragedy, rhetoric, form, causation, and the ordering of human life before the visible and invisible alike. Plato did not merely propose opinions. Aristotle did not merely compile observations. Socrates did not merely ask questions. Each stood within a world where philosophy still dared to be architectonic, where thought was not yet shamed into narrow specialization before it had earned the right to speak. This book is written under the conviction that a comparable boldness is again required. Not imitation of the ancients, but a seriousness proportionate to theirs. Not repetition of their categories, but recovery of their scale. The present age has learned to know more and more about less and less, often with extraordinary technical precision and disastrous metaphysical poverty. We possess analyses without orientation, data without gravity, expertise without integrative sight, and language without sufficient architecture to house the brokenness by which so many now live. This work therefore proceeds as if philosophy must once again become large enough to see in more than one direction at once. To say this plainly, this book is written very nearly under the claim that another era of philosophy is possible, and that the conditions for its emergence depend upon our learning again how to think structurally, symbolically, relationally, ethically, metaphysically, and apophatically at the same time. Not because all distinctions must collapse, but because reality itself does not respect the disciplinary partitions by which modern thought has attempted to manage its own anxiety. Fear is psychological, yes, but also rhetorical, political, moral, theological, bodily, imaginal, interpersonal, historical, and metaphysical. Moral injury is clinical, yes, but also symbolic, covenantal, epistemic, familial, juridical, and ontological. Language is communicative, yes, but also architectonic. It does not merely report worlds, it builds thresholds, closures, mirrors, prisons, corridors, altars, disguises, and bridges. Thus, Boanerges concerns itself with the manner in which language, perception, negation, contradiction, relation, and traversal generate not only meaning, but worlds of inhabitation. The term metaphysical linguistics, as used in relation to this project, must therefore be understood with full seriousness. It does not mean that words float above reality in some decorative spiritual cloud. It means that language participates in the very structuring of intelligibility. It means that the forms by which we name, deny, distinguish, repeat, invoke, orient, and withhold are not incidental to the world we experience, but constitutive of the ways in which that world becomes livable, unbearable, traversable, or lost. A person may be morally injured long before he can define the injury, because the architecture of the rupture precedes the vocabulary adequate to carry it. A civilization may remain trapped within certain fears because its available speech is too flat to articulate the dimensions of what it is actually enduring. A family may replay inherited contradiction because the relation itself is already linguistic in structure before anyone consciously identifies the pattern. A political order may be governed by unseen metaphors more powerfully than by visible laws. A religion may become captive to a grammar that its adherents have mistaken for revelation itself. To study these things is already to enter the field this work is trying to bring forward. Boanerges, then, is intended as a universalizing but not flattening discipline of understanding. It seeks to become applicable not by reducing everything to one answer, but by discerning the transferable structures by which many different realities may be approached. Its question is not, how can all things be made the same, but rather, what forms of relation, contradiction, traversal, delegated presence, fear, interpretation, and emergence recur across domains without losing their domain-specific weight. This is why the work may bear upon the mind, politics, economics, family, marriage, religion, institutional life, symbolic production, moral psychology, and even the philosophy of exploration, whether terrestrial, interpersonal, civilizational, or cosmic. The point is not to force all subjects into metaphor. The point is to see that certain architectures are operative across scales. The labyrinth is one such architecture. Fear is another. Proxy and presence are another. Absence functioning as presence is another. The inability to proceed because one has defined travel too narrowly is another. These are not merely poetic gestures. They are candidates for principles of intelligibility, and anything that is intelligible can either presently or eventually be or become inhabitable, fractally or in fullness. Accordingly, this book is not designed to be consumed as a straight line from premise to conclusion. It is meant to be entered. It is meant to be undergone. It is meant to require something from the reader beyond passive assent. In this respect, it behaves less like an information delivery device and more like a chamber of resonant testing, where one does not simply read propositions, but encounters operations. The libretto form matters because song, refrain, invocational return, and dramatic voicing preserve dimensions of thought that prose alone often suppress. The thesis form matters because rigor, distinction, and structural consequence cannot be abandoned without losing the seriousness of the undertaking. The hybrid is necessary because the realities at stake exceed the carrying capacity of either form in isolation. Tragedy teaches what systems alone cannot bear. System preserves what lyric alone cannot stabilize. Invocation opens what analysis cannot force. Analysis clarifies what invocation cannot safely leave unbounded. Therefore, the hybrid is not indulgence. It is discipline of a rarer kind. I'm sure you will find that Aristotle would wholeheartedly agree if he could be here to do so. Maybe he is, simply by speaking of him. Fear occupies a privileged position in this architecture because fear is among the greatest hidden engineers of human worlds. Fear narrows sight, but it also builds systems. Fear hides, but it also projects. Fear distorts, but it also organizes. Fear is capable of making a person, a family, a city, a religion, or an age inhabit a false architecture so completely that the architecture begins to feel more natural than truth itself. Thus, in this book, fear is not treated as one emotion among others, but as a formative principle whose operations ramify through perception, memory, language, conscience, law, desire, theology, politics, and imagination. If fear can become architecture, then understanding fear requires architecture in return. One does not merely speak against fear. One must learn to walk within and through the structures it has raised, to discern load-bearing illusions from genuine thresholds, to distinguish what conceals from what protects, what binds from what orients, what wounds from what reveals the wound. It is here that moral injury becomes not merely a topic, but a gateway. For moral injury exposes, with devastating clarity, the inadequacy of simplified anthropology. It shows that a human being can know and not know simultaneously, consent and not consent, survive and still be shattered, act and yet remain acted upon, be guilty and wounded, be innocent and implicated, be sinned against and yet become a participant in inherited harm, Such divided conditions demand a language able to hold contradiction without collapsing into relativism, and able to name responsibility without reducing all persons to single-axis moral cartoons. Bear in mind that relativism and our understanding of it may not be the problem, but rather collapse and our understanding of it in relation to how much we simultaneously demonize and worship relativism. If this work has any right to speak, it derives in part from the fact that moral injury is among the most revealing crucibles for a larger philosophical awakening. At the point where conscience, violence, memory, and relation can no longer be contained by inherited simplifications, thought is forced either to become deeper or to become dishonest. This is also why the work proceeds epiphatically. It does not seek immediate mastery over its objects. It does not pretend that definition alone grants possession. It recognizes that some realities first become visible by the stripping away of false sufficiencies. To say what a thing is not always evasion. Sometimes it is the necessary clearing by which vision becomes possible. Sometimes the false container must be broken before the living thing can be encountered. In this sense, Boanergics is committed to an apophatic discipline not of emptiness for its own sake, but of honest non-idolatry. It refuses to let language become a counterfeit ownership of realities that exceed our first formulas. It insists that understanding may require negation, asymmetry, displacement, and return. It is willing to proceed by way of pressure, silence, fracture, inversion, and recursive encounter when those are more faithful than premature closure. The intentionality of this book is therefore double. It seeks first to tell the truth about a wound and the structures that surround it, but it seeks second to generate a field of understanding from that truth-telling. It does not want merely to lament moral injury. It wants to transmute the seriousness of moral injury into a disciplined enlargement of human intelligibility. If the wound exposes the inadequacy of inherited forms, then one response is despair, another is cynicism, another is endless fragmentation. But another, and this is the wager of the present work, is that the wound may become a generative threshold through which a broader framework of understanding begins to emerge, not because suffering is sacred in itself, nor because damage automatically confers wisdom, but because some fractures reveal the load-bearing lines of reality more clearly than comfort and patterned, blemishless perfection ever could. In this way, the book stands not only against reduction, but against the starvation of philosophy itself. Too much contemporary thought has accepted confinement to commentary, analysis, critique, or local utility. These have their place, but philosophy worthy of the human being must again dare to ask what kind of world a person inhabits, what structures govern intelligibility, what relation obtains between language and being, what fear does to civilization, what conscience is under injury, how absence may function as presence, how persons traverse impossible distances, how delegated agency alters understanding, how symbolic and literal architectures interpenetrate, and what sort of disciplines are needed if the modern partition between inward and outward knowing is to be overcome. This book intends to stand in that forgotten breadth. If it sounds too large, it is because the age has become too accustomed to thinking too small. The work's universality, however, is not imperial. It does not seek to dominate all fields by annexing them under one fashionable banner. Rather, it seeks to become serviceable across domains because it concerns itself with structures that many domains already suffer under without adequate shared language. A politician navigating mass fear, a husband and wife trapped in recursive contradiction, a child interpreting a divided home, a believer wrestling with heaven and absence, a scholar tracing symbolic recurrence, a therapist encountering divided conscience, an engineer rethinking presence, an economist confronting trust and abstraction, a community attempting repair after betrayal. All may stand, in different ways, within architectures this work seeks to name. Thus, its universal application is not the claim that everything is the same, but that many things are traversed by homologous structures, requiring comparable depth of attention. To state the ambition plainly, this book is intended as Genesis. Not the finished science, not the final doctrine, not the completed school, but the generative beginning of a greater order of understanding. It aims to be seed chamber, ignition point, and first instrument of orientation for what may later become clearer, more rigorous, more testable, more collaborative, and more formally developed by others as well as by the author. If it succeeds, it will not succeed because every claim made here is already complete. It will succeed because it makes visible a scale of relation that others can no longer unsee. It will succeed because it restores courage to thought. It will succeed because it shows that the labyrinth is not merely a prison, but also a form of knowledge waiting for proper traversal. It will succeed because it renders fear newly legible. It will succeed because it permits the inward, the outward, and the all-around to appear as dimensions of one larger task. I do not present this work modestly in the false sense. It is written with reverence, but not timidity. It is written with awareness of tradition, but not submission to the assumption that the great era of philosophy is behind us. It is written with seriousness towards the ancients, but also with the conviction that rediscovery is possible, that what has lain fragmented across theology, tragedy, rhetoric, psychology, symbolic thought, moral experience, and metaphysical longing may yet be gathered into a new coherence. If this coherence proves worthy, then Boanergics may stand not as a private invention, but as the recovery of something human beings have long needed and only partially possessed. A way to understand reality multidirectionally, to interpret suffering structurally, to navigate contradiction faithfully, and to carry language to the threshold where worlds are made, deformed, and redeemed. Therefore, let this statement of intent stand as declaration and threshold. This book is written to open a field. It is written to recover the scale of thought. It is written to name architectures of fear and injury without surrendering to them. It is written to restore seriousness to form. It is written to forge a language capable of bearing rupture without falsifying it. It is written to inaugurate Boanergics as a proto-scientific and proto-philosophical order of understanding, universally extensible because structurally grounded, ambitious because necessity demands ambition, and hybrid in form because reality itself exceeds the carrying power of simpler vessels. It is written in the belief that another era of philosophy may begin not by turning away from injury, contradiction, and labyrinth, but by passing through them with enough courage, rigor, and imaginative fidelity to discover that they were never merely obstacles. They were entrances. Entrances into worlds we once thought we could buy our way into with money, convenience, demand lacking all authority, never once facing and considering that maybe the appropriate amount and degree of suffering was always the key. The key not cut by perfection, but by good enough.